All right. I'm Kelly Rogers, Assistant Editor for DevX, and today we want to take a closer look at some of the current trends and challenges in the monitoring and evaluation sector. It's a massive sector, and it's one that, as my panelists on this Google Hangout today can probably confirm, gets a certain amount of attention, although that attention has definitely increased probably over the past 5 years even. But let me introduce my panelists on this Google Hangout today. I'm joined by Anne LaFond, who is the director of the JSI Center for Health Information Monitoring and Evaluation and Senior Evaluation Advisor at John Snow Inc. She also serves as project director for the innovations for MNCH, and Anne has worked with JSI for 16 years, and her work focuses on capacity building of health sector monitoring and evaluation systems, implementation research, and use of evidence for health system performance improvement. So welcome, Anne.
Thank you. Thanks, Kelly.
And Keith Brown. Keith is a senior vice president at MSI. He's helping to lead much of the firm's work in strategic management and performance improvement. He has more than 2 decades of experience in organizational strategic planning and performance measurement. And he has worked hand in hand with USAID, the U.S. Department of Labor, and the International Labor Organization and the World Food Program to improve their performance. So welcome, Keith.
Thanks very much, Kelly.
So I think we're just going to jump right in. I know we have a lot we want to cover today. And obviously, there's a big push in development to understand why and how things happen. And that's a big part of both of your roles. But doing that often requires mixed method approach, or increasingly, and that includes blending more qualitative and quantitative data approaches. And I'm wondering if that blend of methods is becoming more embraced from your perspectives.
Anne, you want to start?
Sure, thanks. I think from the perspective of the health sector, which is really our area at JSI, we have traditionally focused on whether programs work or not. So there's been a lot of focus on performance of health programs, and then increasingly on the impact of health programs. Are they actually influencing changes in health status? But in the last 5 years or so, I think the development community is asking not just does it work, but how and why things work. And we really welcome those changes in thinking through how to do health and development in a better way, because it's not good enough just to have an assessment that says this program was stellar, it was great, or this program failed. If it actually improved health or it reached its goals, we really want to understand what was it in the implementation design and the strategies that enabled it to do so. And that requires us to introduce several different kinds of methodologies to be able to answer questions of that nature. It's exciting for us because JSI is an organization that's very focused on implementation and public health implementation and trying to get that implementation strategy just right. So just measuring outcomes isn't enough. We really need to understand how and why, and our M&E teams are gearing up day to day to try and help projects answer those questions while they're implementing as well as after the implementation has taken place.
Yeah, I think, Kelly, I'd just jump in and say you hear a lot about learning organizations in international development now, and that requires not, as Anne was saying, not just understanding whether and to what extent programs are achieving the results they intend to achieve. It also really means we have to understand what are the reasons that are driving performance that perhaps exceeds our expectations, so we can take advantage of what we learn in those circumstances. It also means we have to learn more about the things that are holding us back, the constraints. And if we can do that, then we can make those kind of mid-course corrections that lead to better performance and results. So the notion of mixed methods in terms of data collection and data use is a good thing. I think it's actually been around for a while, but the difference is that the demand for that type of information is growing, and the sophistication of the groups that we work with and for is also expanding, so that there's better utilization, although I still think this is a big issue, this notion of utilization, but there's better ability to utilize differentiated data sets and differentiated data sources. So it's a lot of what's been happening over the last 5 to 10 years is definitely what I think we as monitoring evaluation professionals are really happy to see, because at the end of the day it drives more effective programming.
Exactly, and it allows us to be involved at every stage of the process. So we don't just come in at the end and say, oh, did it work or didn't it, but we're actually involved in thinking how to use data strategically to design the program better, to set up good monitoring systems and learning systems, and then at the end to understand whether the program worked or not. And it really integrates M&E into the whole strategy of programming.
And it's also a continuing learning process, I think, for M&E teams, just what evaluations, are right in which situations and for which projects. And I'm wondering, when do you know when to use a new method of M&E for a project, or how is that decision made?
Well, let me take a. I'll try to be succinct. Not one of my strengths, but I think that the right method and the selection of the right mix of methods has to do with the characteristics of the project, the context in which that project or program is operating, the available resources, and the time frame. And so you have to balance all those factors when making a decision about what is the right set of methods to use in a given situation. I think this is a developing understanding for the clients that we work with and for the donor agencies that we try to partner with. And by that I mean, in the past, we've had a bit of a situation where you might have a focus or a predetermined notion on the part of a donor agency about the kind of methodology it might want to use for a given situation. This is from my point of view, one of the issues that happened, for example, with MCC when it initially got into randomized control trials. There was a very heavy heavy focus on the use of randomized control trials for virtually, or at least an attempt to apply it to virtually all of the MCC compact activities. And frankly, RCTs are they're a wonderful methodology, wonderful design approach, but not appropriate to every circumstance, both for reasons of cost, but also because certain projects and programs simply aren't well suited to an experimental design, a fully experimental design. But there was an attempt sometimes to push sort of that round peg into a square hole. I think that what's happened now is that there's an increase, and this is this idea of an increase in sophistication across the board in terms of M&E providers and M&E users. And so now there's a recognition that, okay, we want to apply the most, this is sort of the line we use and the line we hear a lot, it's a good line, which is that we want to apply the most rigorous methods available that apply to this project in this circumstance and resources available. Now that may be a performance evaluation, it may be a quasi-experimental design with some mixed methods surrounding that design, or it may be a fully randomized control trial. It really depends on a host of situations and circumstances or considerations. So I think it's, I think that you don't know, there isn't a formula or an algorithm that this kind of project always gets this kind of an evaluation design, this kind of a project always should have this type of a performance metric or set of metrics. It's a situation by situation, project by project consideration that has to, that has to be undertaken, and that really requires both the users and the technical specialists to have a fairly deep set of skills and a nuanced sense and appreciation for how to apply those M&E technologies.
That's right. I agree with you, and I do think what we've tried to focus on a lot is understanding who the audience is for the information that you're producing, because for a long time the monitoring and evaluation was for the funder and not so much for the implementers. And I think the tide is turning, and we are focusing much more on what is the information that implementers need to be able to make decisions, either within a project or indeed within a country. And those information needs can vary quite a bit. I think we've learned a lot about involving the stakeholders in defining what those research questions are, or those M&E questions are, and really honing our M&E methods to make sure that people are getting the information they need to do their jobs better. And in that way, we've become more human-centered, and we've actually, I think, increased our capacity to be much more focused on how to use information to get results, not just producing results at the end of a project.
And that's interesting, and something I wanted to bring up was the focus on providing data for implementers, or a greater focus there. Has that changed the entire process, I guess, with which you kind of go into things, thinking about that, and not just, we need to provide this report to the donors, but this is information that can be incredibly useful from start to finish for the implementers as well?
I think it's still a tussle. Because the donors need to know where their resources are going, and they have to report back to their stakeholders. And we spend a lot of time trying to balance that between the usefulness of data for the program and making sure that the program does pay its dues and actually report back to the funders. So it's a constant balancing act, and I think our standpoint, we would always err on the side of creating systems that are producing data that people can use to make decisions, and that reporting can come out of that data set and still inform the donors. But you don't start with the idea that we just want to report out. You start with the idea that we want to use data to make decisions.
Yeah, I think that's just very well put. If the point of departure for an M&E system is the reporting requirement, then you won't have the data set you need to make informed decisions. I do think that one of the things we always face in monitoring and evaluation is sort of I was going to say implicit, but it's really not implicit, this sort of friction between accountability and learning. Mm-hmm. It's not that those two things have to be in sort of at contest with each other, but many organizations are historically and currently even more comfortable in that sort of accountability conversation. We are spending money. We need to be able to show that we spent the money correctly, not just from a financial point of view, but also in terms of our programming. And so we want to be able to say, if we were going to do this many trainings or deliver these many services, that we did so. And if we can move it up a little bit, move it up a notch to determine or to talk about what the delivery of those services actually produced in terms of outcomes or immediate level outcomes, great. But the sort of what we've worked hard on over the last 10 or 15 years is really moving the culture of the conversation towards learning. Because as Ann says, if you collect the basket of information that informs learning at its greatest, sort of at all its levels, you'll be able to extract from that absolutely the information that you need to report effectively at any level, from an implementer to a donor, from a donor to their external stakeholders on up the chain. But I do think it's a very interesting puzzle that we're always engaging, this conversation between accountability and learning. And even though you see a lot of language now and a lot of sort of posture around the notion of learning, it's an ongoing battle to really pull folks, and managers particularly, into the learning process.
Yeah, I think that's true. And creating space within your health programs for managers to step back and look at the data that they have is also a big challenge. We do emphasize a lot of action in the field. There's always this ethos of, if you're doing something, you're actually making progress. And the M&E systems need to enable those implementers to continue to make progress, but we also have to create space for them to sit back, reflect on what they've learned over the course of a month or 3 months or 6 months, and then ask themselves if the kind of strategies that they're putting into place are making progress in the direction that they hope they will do. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges. Often the M&E staff are stuck in a little room and they're crunching data, and then they put a report out, and they're not brought into that kind of decision making during the times when projects are thinking strategically about how things are going. And we spend a lot of time trying to bring program staff and M&E staff together to be part of a strategic thinking team, a learning team for each activity.
Yeah, and that's actually something else that I wanted to touch on that I feel this has led into, and it's something that Keith and I discussed yesterday was, just creating that context of learning and changing the culture of an organization. So far as that is just part of the culture is that you're using this information to learn, and Anne, you mentioned, making sure that you're always bringing people together. Are there other ways of building that culture of learning that you guys are working on?
Um, uh, I'll take a crack at this one, Ann, and then pass it to you. So, when we talked yesterday, Kelly, I talked about I'm gonna take one step back on that question, if you don't mind, and then I'll
Sure.
circle back and answer it. And that is this notion, the question of utilization of monitoring and evaluation information. And Ann was just talking about the things that she does on the projects to really promote, integrating the monitoring and evaluation process into the broader management discussion of their projects and programs. So this is something that we really find to be one of the biggest challenges as a monitoring and evaluation provider to implementing partners and donors and different agencies. How to really focus on and bring utilization of that information right into the middle of the management process. And I think there's three things that are the constraints, and if we can address those constraints, are the solutions to better utilization. One is culture, and I think moving an organization from a traditional focus on work plan and budget and managing work plan and budget and accountability and sort of as Ann said, just getting things done and making sure that we're cranking out our work and moving them to a place where they will take a step back and say, if we've delivered all these workshops, are we seeing improved learning? Are we seeing change behaviors as a result of that learning? Are we seeing improved coordination or collaboration, et cetera, et cetera? Getting an organization to understand that that is management, and also that failing in something is okay as long as you know that you failed and you have an idea of why. And so building systems that can embrace learning. I've often said to the folks that I work with on results-based management, I say, look, you are building a system that essentially wants to learn in the near to medium term so that you can perform in the medium to long term. Mm-hmm. And learning in the near to medium term sometimes will mean learning from success and sometimes will mean learning from failure. So moving an organization into that space and into that kind of a culture takes time, but it's absolutely imperative if monitoring and evaluation efforts are really to essentially effectuate the kind of management that we hope to see. The second constraint, I think, has to do with, frankly, the skills and aptitudes of managers. It's as we develop a more sophisticated set of monitoring and evaluation tools, as we look at mixed method approaches to what we do, as managers are faced with different types of data, different qualities of data from different sources, their ability to understand and to essentially weigh different data sets and to allow their understanding of those data to inform a set of emerging or identify the management issues and then help to inform possible options for making decisions. That set of skills and aptitude is really pretty tough. It's tough to find that in a manager who's also being asked to manage finance and work plan and personnel and 100 other things. And then the last thing I'll say is I think, and this is one of the places where we're really seeing a lot of innovation, is we need to make data and monitoring and evaluation information more easily accessible to managers. That means in the way we visually display data, in the way we present it, in the way we integrate data, perhaps with video or with narrative, but really getting to a place where we can allow managers to have better and easier access to data that are the result of very sophisticated M&E designs and methodologies. That's another piece of the puzzle that we're still working on. So I think if we move culture in the right direction, if we improve the skills and aptitudes of those managers, and we help that process along by doing a better job of basically making data digestible and accessible through data visualization, then I think that's how we really get to better use and to better programming in the end.
Yeah, it's very true. I think the health sector is a good example of where that's not quite where we are yet, because we have many, many different health information systems that are imposed on the team. For example, the team in a health facility. They're reporting on maternal health, they're reporting on child health, they're reporting on HIV. They might have different reporting structures and systems for each organization or each program that they're working on. They might have an integrated system that means they have to spend hours on end of their day filling in forms or entering data into computers. And it's not simple. It's actually very complicated, and it is very disheartening for a lot of health staff. So we are looking at ways to try to streamline information, to try and put information in their hands that is really what they need to make decisions, rather than creating a system that collects every element of information that is possible to collect from that health facility. So simplification and streamlining, I completely agree with you, and it's a challenge for us as health opportunities emerge and challenges emerge. It becomes more difficult to do that. Just the recent Ebola crisis is asking why don't we have surveillance systems that detect these kinds of things. Surveillance systems are hard to manage, but are yet another layer on top of a regular health information system. Where do you decide what's essential information and what isn't essential information? And it's a real challenge. On the culture side, what we've found in some of the research we've done on why information systems work is that groups of people that work together to try and understand information and make decisions together through mutual accountability are very, very effective. And data is needed to help them understand where they are, where they want to go, and where they've actually, whether they've actually moved forward in the right direction. We found that if you don't have something that motivates people to use data to improve their work, they find it a very rote and very uninspiring process to do monitoring and evaluation. So you really have to think about not just the technology of the information system, but the organizational context in which people are working, the incentives that we provide to reward people for being good thinkers with data, and also what kind of behavioral incentives should you put in place to give people to really jazz them up about data. I think that people working in the health system in developing countries are often overworked. They are underpaid, they are working without enough resources, there's often large demand, and the last thing that they want is a system that just drags them down and makes them, fill forms and not do their work well. So we are constantly looking at ways to streamline data and create organizational contexts that inspire people to do good data-based work. It's not easy, but that's our goal.
And just you mentioning, well, Keith, you mentioned innovations, and Anne, you mentioned also the need to streamline. Are there innovations in this sector that almost are contrary to that? I mean, are there kind of ideas that people have and ways that, almost feeling like you're required to do things that are just complicating the process, and maybe that data isn't even as useful, or maybe that's not really the best way to be doing it, but someone's pushing it because it's new and exciting? So I'm wondering if there's kind of those contrary situations.
Well, I think there are a lot of people that are excited about technology and still thinking that technology is the answer, because developing information technology is an exciting field. It's really taking off in our countries, and there is this tendency to try and just apply it in the field and think that's going to be your magic bullet. Mobile health is an example. There's cases where mobile health has been introduced into health systems and it's worked very well, and there's examples where it hasn't worked very well. And I think we're learning a lot from these experiments in introducing technology or new technology into areas. I think where the innovation really needs to focus is how do we actually make our designs of our technology or our projects that introduce technology much more based on human-centered design principles. How do we actually find out what's going to make people's jobs easier, what will motivate them to be good data users, and then use the innovation, whether it's technology, whether it's training, whether it's motivation, use that to actually create an easier world for them. We tend to think technology is the answer, but in many cases it creates a much more complicated world for them.
I'll just pick up on a couple of those themes. I think that technology can be very powerful. I think going back to comments, just a couple comments back from Ann, getting folks excited about data and monitoring and evaluation information is a big piece of getting them to actually use it. That's why, if you put together a nice dashboard with a lot of cool-looking stuff and some good maps and some georeference stuff and some other things, you'll find that managers are drawn to looking at that and are interested in it. It's certainly not a substitute. Putting up a dashboard with empty data behind it isn't going to be a good thing, but using technology to engage people, both managers and, frankly, even the folks, the respondents that we collect data from a lot. I remember when SurveyMonkey came out and we started using SurveyMonkey, there was it was fascinating for me how many people responded to surveys in the SurveyMonkey format that wouldn't respond to it in let's say, a pen and paper format. So I think technology can be a facilitator for collecting data. Technology can be a facilitator for capturing and organizing data, and certainly for presenting data and therefore using data. But I also agree that it can be a distraction. I looked at a report that crossed my desk a while ago. It was a very good-looking report, really cool data visualizations, and then and I was so interested and captured by it that I wanted to read more on it. And as I read more on it, I realized that the methodology behind the data that were captured by those beautiful pictures was so immensely flawed that I thought it was not only a distraction, but probably was a disservice to those of us who were consuming the information in the report. So I think, again, back to your question, Kelly, the decision on the right approach for data collection and or analysis and or visualization goes back to what is the project, what is the context, what would be the best way to collect data. I take Ann's point on human-centered sort of consideration, and then making that decision based on what will be the best way to get good data and to use the data, and then figuring out which technology facilitates it. We don't lead with the technology. The point of departure is what's the best way to do our work and to get good information in the hands of decision makers. Then we'll go ahead and try and find out what kind of technologies can facilitate that.
Yeah, and Keith, that reminds me of something that you also said yesterday. You gave an example of when complex is not necessarily better, or when bigger is not necessarily better. Gave an example of a colleague who was kind of almost going back to utilizing site visits and conversations around those visits. Obviously not technologically focused, but also still, an effective way, perhaps in that situation, in that context, to gather data. So,
yeah, and Kelly, I do want to actually touch back on that one point. So we've seen a lot of development of evaluation design and different methods over the last 10 years. We're doing a lot more impact evaluation and quasi-experimental and experimental methods. We're integrating qualitative methodologies into those experimental designs. But what's interesting is that we have to remember evaluation is still episodic. So we're getting information in our evaluation activities. We're getting information periodically, usually with fairly significant time intervals in between the actual data being available to us. So then we have our monitoring systems that are meant to give us a sense of what's going on an ongoing basis. There's probably too much, although I'm a big fan of performance monitoring and performance sort of results-based management systems and monitoring systems. There may be too great an emphasis on that, because really performance monitoring is a flag-raising system. Are we on track based on the expectations we've set for ourselves? Not if we're not on track, performance monitoring doesn't do a very good job of answering why or why not, or suggesting possible interventions or management decisions that can get us back to a high-performing project or program. The colleague I was telling you about is down in Columbia and said, look, I need to be able to inform management decisions on a more timely basis and in a more sort of comprehensive basis. And so I want to keep performance monitoring and keep the evaluation work we're doing, but there's still this gap that that exists for a lot of what I'm looking at, and that has to do with how do I get deeper, richer, better information on a more timely basis so that I can inform my management decisions that I have to take in between those really great buckets of data that come out of our evaluation episodes. And so he is experimenting with an approach that is essentially a sort of a structured qualitative process for the site visit, using performance information as well, but using that kind of approach to fill what he feels is a big information gap, which is essentially constraining the managers of those projects and programs for making the kind of timely mid-course corrections that he's really trying to assist and facilitate. So in that case, yeah, we are going back to the future, I guess, or I'm not quite sure if that's the right analogy, but we're going back with some adjustments, and it's not a highly sophisticated approach, but it probably is a very enriching piece of a more comprehensive M&E package that allows managers to do their job better.
Yes. Yeah, we've had the same experience in several projects that we're working in, is the donors requiring an impact evaluation of the model, but at the same time the managers are saying, well, we have a theory of change. It says this is how the program is supposed to unfold and the intermediate results we're supposed to achieve, but we need to understand if those pathways are actually emerging as planned. So we're introducing more than monitoring, is I think what you're saying is it's actually asking the how and why questions, going back to the end users and asking how they're integrating with the project and whether the changes are taking place that we hope will take place. And it's really important for managers to have that information. They don't just want to count the beans and say, yes, we've done 10 trainings or we've reached 150 people, but we want to know, did we reach them with the right messages? Are they understanding those messages? And are they thinking about the behavior changes that we're hoping will emerge from this intervention? And we don't want to wait 5 years to ask those questions. We want to ask them right away, because if we're missing the mark, we need to change our strategies or pivot, as we say, to a new strategy or try something different. And it's that real-time developmental evaluation that I think is the really exciting area of monitoring and evaluation. Michael Quinn Patton has been trying to sell this idea and saying that it's not enough just to do standard M&E. We have to really, ethically, it's important to ask these difficult questions while things are happening so that we can do the best service we can to the organizations and the people that we're trying to support. So developmental evaluation is kind of an area where I think a lot of us are experimenting. We're trying to understand how to balance out the demands for rigor when people are trying to look at randomized control trials as the be-all and end-all, and we're saying that's good and fine for answering some questions, but we really need to know in between what's happening and whether we're doing a good job. So again, we're balancing between trying to create real information that can help people, and also trying to have something that's of a standard and a level of rigor that everyone will respect in the end, to say, yes, you've made an impact on people's health or whatever you're trying to focus on.
Definitely, and I guess to complicate matters potentially, and when we were talking earlier just about the health systems work that you do in complex and potentially dysfunctional systems, and then Keith, I know that MSI does work in conflict and post-conflict areas. So I guess I'm just wondering if one or both of you can expand on that and how much that complicates a situation and how those potentially dysfunctional systems really need to be accounted for in, I guess, the preparation of what kind of M&E you're going to put in place.
And you want to take the first crack this time?
Sure, I'll try. I think there's been a shift, at least in the health sector, to looking much more at how systems perform and understanding that our end goal is national health systems that can provide services to people over the long term, and that our mechanisms for doing that might be projects or programs or interventions, but in the end it's the system that needs to change. And when you're talking about a system, you're talking about a lot of moving parts that aren't always moving collectively in the right direction. So you really need to understand that complexity to be able to be a good practitioner in the health sector. That requires us to step back and use different kinds of methods to map out what the needs are and where the barriers are, and then to define strategies over time to address those things. One of the areas that we've been investing in a lot is case study evaluation, and we're doing it prospectively in some cases and retrospectively in others as a learning technique. And case studies help you understand complexity. They're meant to actually unpack all of the different variables that are in place, looking at how they relate to each other, and try and unpack the story of what's happening or what has happened. They are. And this is a case study not for learning purposes, but as a research methodology that asks the standard set of research questions over time. They're very helpful, especially if you're doing multiple case studies, to try and understand why things work in some settings and not in others. They do help us understand that context makes a huge difference, and that while programs might work in one place, we need to understand whether they're able to be replicated in other places or scaled up from one part of the country to the other. And it really forces us to not just take one methodology to answer our questions, but to combine, like you said, the mixed methods to not only answer is it working, but how and why are things working, and you know, whether the context is playing a strong role in this or whether it's not playing a strong role. The complexity question is really taking off in the health sector because of our health systems approach now, but we're still having to I don't want to say combat, but to struggle with the fact that most M&E systems in the past have been very linear. They've been all about inputs, processes, outputs, and outcomes, measuring towards results. And somewhere in the middle is actually a methodology that, as Keith said, helps us to learn, not just to report. And acknowledgement of the complexity that we deal with is I think, a first step in trying to get us to be much more focused on learning and M&E systems that help us learn.
It's exciting to listen to Anne talk about this, because I think that, you know, let's just take randomized control trials for a second. Randomized control trials are a wonderful tool, and they're particularly good at testing hypotheses. But testing hypotheses is only one aspect of all of the issues and questions and points that we have to look at in the field of development. I think the health system strengthening discussion, which Anne just talked about, is a great case in point. In the fact that case study methodology, which really allows for a attention to a incredibly rich set of potential facilitators and constraints and factors, is probably a great approach to that. I'll probably look forward to exploring that more. Mm-hmm. I'm going to take a slightly different tact on this. You talked about complex systems and also complex environments. I'll take a little bit of a tack on the complex environments. So we work in a lot of places: Afghanistan, Iraq, South Sudan, and several others, which are unstable and sometimes unsafe. And we have to. What's interesting is that these are also the kinds of the places where the U.S. government and other donors are spending an increasingly large portion of their funds. So you've got a lot more money and a lot more actors moving into places which are increasingly difficult to collect data in. And those organizations, those donor organizations, have a very serious accountability concern in those places, because they're spending a lot of money and because their taxpayers are wondering whether and to what extent that money is being well spent. So I think that what you're seeing in terms of sort of emerging issues and innovations to respond to those issues is this whole field of verification. So verification has become an important, increasingly important, if you will, sort of functional area inside the M&E world, and it requires a different set of technologies and approaches than we typically use. So that means we have to do a lot of essentially remote monitoring. Most folks are familiar with satellite imagery and aerial photography. We also have to now look at issues like environmental sensors that essentially are, do not require human intervention in order to collect the data, and are still providing data on a continual basis. We have to look at things, even consider things in the right situation, obviously not in insecure places, related to sort of the ability of drone technology to pick up information. So as we get into this whole world of verification, we're expanding the technologies that we use, because we have to collect data in very demanding environments, and we actually have to collect somewhat different types of data in those demanding environments. So I think that, just like the recognition of the complexity of the systems that we're working in, the recognition of the complexity of the environments we're working in, and the instability of those environments is forcing us into new ways of thinking, adjustments to existing technologies, and sometimes development of whole new technologies in order to get the information that managers and planners need.
And again, it seems like that touches on, I guess, building the skills of the people who are going to manage these systems, and how do you, I guess, make sure that someone has enough nuanced understanding of, you know, XYZ new technology in order to take in all of these different data sources and still be able to understand it and use their best judgment, you know, for mid-course correction or for whatever it might be. So it seems like it's increasingly becoming, perhaps, from the sounds of it, a talent issue as well. Just making sure that you have, you know, the right people in place that can do that.
Yeah, and I really should mention one other thing. That's right, Kelly. And another consideration is certainly when we're working in these unstable environments where we aren't going out to collect the data, but we're using a lot of local partners and partner organizations. We really have a lot of, we have to pay particular attention to ethical issues, identity and safety. And so, you know, if you go to any of the American Evaluation Association, the United Nations, they all have sets of ethics around evaluation and data collection, and those things are really, really in play as we engage in more complicated, more unstable, and more difficult work environments.
Well, one other thing that I wanted to touch on too was, I guess, just reporting requirements on the donor side of things. It's something that I think our audience is really interested in, especially the negotiation of how to address multiple donors and multiple donor requirements, and making sure that you're able to, and also, as we're saying, still able to make that same data really beneficial for implementers. It just seems like kind of you're kind of balancing on a little precipice there. So I was wondering if one or either of you could touch on that and how you're able to navigate that.
Yeah, it's a challenge, especially with the proliferation of different health programs. By the same token, for example, USAID has invested a lot of resources through projects like Measure Evaluation to try and standardize the way that reporting is done. So we're lucky in the health sector that we have a lot of opportunity to standardize indicators. We can measure things in the same way over time, and yet every program has a minimum set of standardized indicators. So they tend to be, you know, there tends to be a proliferation of them. So where we've streamlined and consolidated in some ways, we've actually duplicated that across several different programs. So countries themselves are being encouraged to say, these are the data that we want to collect, these are the decisions we want to make, these are the indicators that we need, and we'll be able to report those back up the system. And we put those into our National Health Information System. And if you want additional information, donors, you can fund studies. You can actually, you know, introduce different data collection activities. But for us, for our routine reporting, we really need a minimum set. So it's a constant negotiation between government and the donors about what they're supposed to report, but I think as the health ministries get more and more savvy about what they need to make decisions, they're actually stronger in their position of negotiation to say, this is what we need and here's what we'll report back to you. And then they expect additional information collection to be funded outside the system.
Yeah, I just add a couple of points. You know, I guess I would like to congratulate the international development community for at least moving in the right direction on this issue. You know, with the Paris Declaration and Accra and Busan, you see as one of the main tenets of the agreements coming out of those meetings the requirement for donors to themselves on a more significant basis, and also to coordinate with host country partners. And that's around making sure that we don't have 18 or 20 donors asking for 18 or 20 different kinds of things in the same countries, and therefore burdening the government that we're trying to be helping. So I think certainly we've got a ways to go, but the problem has been recognized, and I think there's been some advances on that. I mentioned there's, maybe 15 years ago, 10, 15 years ago, I was working with the ILO, and they were really struggling with the fact that the members that were contributing to the program I was working on had very different reporting requirements, and they had their own internal system that they wanted to implement in order to promote better learning and management. And it was just an unfortunate situation because clearly there was a significant waste of time and energy. There was overlapping data sets being collected. There were discussions and conversations with, between ILO and individual donors that would have been much better engaged across the full donor group and would have been facilitated by let's say a single set of data and/or information. I think that those kinds of conversations still happen, but there's all kinds of dynamics in play now for us moving in the right direction. Folks recognizing the benefits of meta-analysis and meta-evaluation. Well, if we're going to do meta-analysis and meta-evaluation, we want to have consistent data collection across multiple projects or programs. And I imagine, like for a place like John Snow, wanting to learn across multiple projects in different countries means not wanting to set up very, very different systems, just as Anne was talking about. And yes, there's the negotiation with the donor and with the host country government, but it feels to me like, when I'm now having these discussions in place, that there's more alignment. I do see quite a bit of competing requirements inside the USAID world, competing and overlapping, which presents USAID missions with quite a Chinese puzzle to solve sometimes. But I think overall we're moving slowly in the right direction on that.
Yeah.
So if there is this better collaboration and coordination in part of donors, are there other challenges that still remain, especially in reporting this information?
Well, I think the volume of information that is expected to be reported is still enormous, right? And the frequency with which reporting has to take place is huge. And I think countries, they have huge burdens on their health systems, and they have to perform, to a certain standard for their own reporting. So I think what the donors need to be more sensitive to is this idea of buying into the national system and helping them to streamline that core set of data that is needed to make decisions. The volume distracts people, right? And we collect far more data than we could ever use, and that just seems to be the norm. And everyone's enamored of data. Everyone wants to be evidence-based, but you're not being evidence-based unless you actually use the information to make decisions. So you have huge reports that take 2 years to come out, and by then the data is not even useful for decision making. It's great to look retrospectively at what happened, and it's because there's just too much, right? So that idea that Keith mentioned about simplifying systems and simplifying and streamlining is really absolutely critical for countries, at least in the health sector, to be able to then move forward and be able to be nimble and action-oriented with the data that they have, rather than just being a reporting system.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, and I do think that we're seeing a lot of exciting things happening in monitoring and evaluation in international development, and we're developing some new skill sets and methodologies. The technology is facilitating data collection and analysis, but the problems and challenges are we still got a pretty tall stack. So, we even though, for example, the capabilities of in-country monitoring evaluation experts has improved exponentially in the last 15 years. It's just stunning in some countries how much talent there is. There's still a significant dearth of experience and capability in other countries. The quality of data, and I think what Anne talked about, the time lag that's associated with a lot of data sets and the ability to access those data sets is also enormous. The fact that we have inconsistent data sets, so we don't essentially have long time series. Now the health sector does, because they've been ahead of all the rest of us for a while, but an awful lot of sectors really have significant breaks in the time series of critical data. So that makes it difficult to really do the sort of long-term learning that allows us to plan our programs better and to set up sort of new learning models for our monitoring evaluation systems in a more significant fashion. So there's lots of challenges left, and I guess that's why it's exciting. But you know, one of the things that's been, I guess, if I were someone to say what's one of the emerging trends in monitoring evaluation, I would say one of the emerging trends is the amount of attention that's being paid to it. When I worked in the I worked in a USAID mission as a monitoring evaluation specialist 20 years ago, or well, I guess it was more than 20 years ago, unfortunately. You know, when I walked into the room, people would turn around, show me their back of their head, and say, "Can you come back another time, please? I'm sure my monitoring evaluation system will be just fine. I have real work to do." Well, that, you know, now in the middle of a lot of the conversations at USAID and at DFID and down in Australia with DPAD, you know, monitoring evaluation is right in the middle of the conversation. So one of the big sort of pluses is that people care about it and they want to push the envelope. And they want to see how we can learn better and collect better information, and that's exciting.
Yeah. And for me, you know, the outstanding areas for investment are enabling the people to use information. I mean, I agree we have a lot of talent now in collecting data, in designing surveys, and designing information systems. I think we're still lacking on that kind of ability to absorb the information, to ask the right questions, to tackle the kind of strategic questions that ministries of health, for example, have to tackle with data. I think there's more information available, but there isn't a lot of experience in synthesizing that information and making it very useful for the different kinds of decisions that need to be made, whether it's a policy decision or it's an investment decision or it's a training and curricula decision. And I think where our challenge lies, at least in the health sector, is to help our key decision makers be great strategists, to be able to translate that data into meaningful, useful information that they can use then to convince their parliament to get them more resources, or to help a hospital manage its systems more efficiently, or to get services or supplies out to the periphery. And that seems to me an area where there's still open field for investment. And it's not just training. I mean, you can't just go to management school and come back and say, "Oh, I understand all of this." It really is about being there at the decision-making point, helping people map out the different opportunities or the different choices that are there, and being able to weigh data and other factors that are important for decision-making and to make strategic decisions. That, to me, is a huge challenge ahead of us.
Well, thank you guys. I didn't even have to prompt you for those kind of end notes and what you're kind of most excited about and some emerging trends. So if there's anything else you want to add, feel free, but otherwise I really appreciate your insight.
Thanks very much, Kelly. And Anne, it was great to meet you. I look forward to seeing you at conferences, I'm sure.
That would be great. Nice to meet you too, Keith. And Kelly, thanks for the opportunity, and thanks to DevEx for being a good initiator of discussion around monitoring and evaluation.
Definitely. Thank you both. We look forward to continuing it.
Thanks.
Take care.